Hello. Hello. We would like to welcome you at today's conference with Michaël Ghyoot from the Belgian office Rotor. It's the first cycle of 3 meetings called Footprints. I will show. So the cycle is called Footprints, Dziedzictwo na przyszłość. Dzisiejsze spotkanie będzie w języku angielskim, bez tłumaczenia. This cycle is called Footprints, and it's organized by the consortium Open Heritage, SARP Oddział Warszawski, the Polish Architects Association Warsaw Department, Praga Lab, Koło Architektury Zrównoważonej, and with the support of the Belgian Business Chamber and Hub Brussels. We thank you for this support, and this project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under grant agreement number 776766. The European Union is not responsible for the content, only we are the authors and today's performers. Our guest is Michaël Ghyoot, and my name is Michał Sikorski, and I will make a short introduction about Michaël and Rotor. Personally, when I discovered Rotor in 2009, I think, I was very surprised. I was living in Belgium then and just graduated, and I was very surprised to see architects that are not absolutely not interested in form, are interested in materials, and are such geeks that they built a database of materials. Actually, I think the first database you built was a database of Belgian blue stone, if I remember reading then an article about it. So you've been searching places and material storage in the whole country to know where you can find and reuse pieces of stone, metal, or wood. You also built your own office, your temporary office in Belgium. And then 2 years later, you've been invited by OMA and Koolhaas to co-design and co-curate with them an exhibition about their work in the Barbican in London, an exhibition I had the opportunity to see. It was very, very interesting. You keep on writing also and teaching today in the most prestigious schools and writing articles in probably what is the best architectural criticism publication, Criticat. But on the other hand, you also build stages for rave parties or concerts, and you publish books at the Polytechnic School in Lausanne, Michaël, about reusing materials. You're really a Renaissance person, at the same time designing, being an expert in the field of material reuse, and teaching. And animating the architectural scene in Belgium and abroad. On the other hand, you still find the time and the organization capacity to go beyond the normal way of practicing architecture and developing a new business model of selling parts of buildings. So you establish Rotor Deconstruction, Rotor DC, which is a website and a physical shop in Anderlecht, next to Brussels, where when people can buy whole parts of dismantled buildings. So you have an expertise of unbuilding buildings, allowing them to be rebuilt. So thanks to you, in my former kitchen, I had a piece of the Antwerp Town Hall. And in the flat I'm here, we have doorknobs from also another Belgian building. I'm very admirative of the whole your capacity to organize this and your capacity to run to establish new business models and to spread knowledge far beyond your own office. So I'm very curious to see what will you present us today, and welcome in Warsaw, Michael, and even if you couldn't come because of pandemics in person, we warmly welcome you, and the stage is yours.
Hello everybody. Thanks a lot, Michał, for the excellent introduction. Hopefully, I will answer to a few of your questions during the talk. Just let me 1 second to share my screen with you. I guess it should be it. Excellent. So, well, I think Michał already explained quite a lot of things during the introduction. Maybe it's interesting to precise that I'm not alone in Rotor. For the moment, we are about 25 persons working on the 2 different structures. That's also maybe interesting to know that, in fact, we have 2 different entities. On one hand, we have Rotor, the one there, which is a non-profit organization that was established in 2005, and which is still running up to now. And then we launched, as Michał explained, Rotor DC, or Rotor Deconstruction. Actually, it started as a sort of a project hosted within the non-profit organization, but then in 2016, at the end of 2016, it became an autonomous entity organized as a cooperative company. And both entities share the same facilities here in Brussels. So we remain very close to each other, but 2 different structures and 2 different goals. I would say the goal of Rotor DC is pretty simple, although quite hard to implement in practice. It consists of reclaiming and preparing for reuse materials, building materials and building elements. And so it's basically a shop where you can find reclaimed materials. On the other hand, Rotor is active on different levels. As Michał explained, there is a bit of design, a lot of research going on, a bit of teaching and training. And so I will present that in my presentation. What I would like to talk about today is or where I would like to start is with the notion of flows. And I think this is maybe a golden thread between all Rotor's projects during the years, this idea that in fact, we are very curious about material flows in the industry in general, and maybe more specifically in the construction sector. And we are also quite obsessed with the way you can represent flows. And this image on the screen is a very, very beautiful example from the 19th century. It represents the campaign of Napoleon against Russia in the early 19th century. And actually what you see on screen, the brownish arrow, represents the amount of soldiers, and you see them moving through the territory. So there is a sort of geographical dimension in the map, but also you see that it wasn't a big success for Napoleon. And the black arrow is the flow of soldiers coming back to France. And at the end, you see that only a very few of them made it safely back home. So this is a very early representation of flows. Another one, slightly later, is from the British engineer Matthew Sankey, and it represents the way the energy circulates within a steam engine, and it allows to represent, for instance, the energy that is dissipated because of losses during the process. And although it arrived a bit later than Minard, it's Sankey who gave his name to this sort of diagrams. They are called Sankey diagrams, and they are used nowadays in many different contexts. And this is an introduction to this very Sankey diagram that was produced a few years ago by the European Institute for Statistics, and it represents the material flows that are consumed in Europe, in the different states of Europe. So the colors represent the different types of material. You have biomass, ores, non-metallic minerals, and fossil fuels in yellow. And I think, although it's a bit cryptic in its representation, actually it represents quite well, or it summarizes quite well a lot of research we've been undertaking with Rotor this last year. So it's a good backbone for my presentation to try to share with you a few findings we have. So we could start the presentation with the start of the diagram, which is this part, the extraction of natural resources. And you see that it is probably the most important flow on the diagram. And obviously, if you want to illustrate that, you could find very striking pictures, such as this one by Edward Bertinsky, which represents a copper mine in the US. So not in Europe, but I guess it's representative. And you see the scale, the magnitude of such an extraction site. To give an element of scale, these things there are trucks and lorries. So it's really a mountain that has been completely digged out to extract ores and which are then used to produce copper. And this is something interesting because the production and the extraction in itself is a process that produces a lot of waste. Only a small fraction of what you extract from the ground is actually used to produce goods and things. And of course, this ratio depends on each material. For instance, for gold, it's a very, very, very small amount of all what you need to dig out that is used to produce gold. It's a little bit better with iron ore that is used to make steel, for instance. But so it's important to know that even the extraction produces a lot of waste, and these wastes are maybe less known than the post-consumer waste that we are used to deal with on an everyday basis. Not only mineral elements are extracted, but also organic elements such as wood, and it also comes with severe consequences for the environment. And notably, deforestation is really a big concern nowadays. I like this quote from a novel by Richard Powers, which is really an ode to trees and what trees are able to achieve. And it ends with this very interesting punchline, which says, to solve the future, we must save the past. My simple rule of thumb is, when you cut down a tree, what you make from it should be at least as miraculous as what you cut down. So it's an interesting reminder maybe for us architects who are used to use different sorts of materials and wood part of them. And so maybe if we continue on this diagram, we could jump to the second theme, which is the raw and the cooked, as a reference to Lévi-Strauss, of course. But I guess if we had to characterize our economy, it's certainly not the raw, it's mostly the cooked. And that's maybe what happens in the middle of the diagram. You see there the processing of the materials that have been extracted or imported and that are transformed by the economy and the industry in general. And as a matter of fact, most of the industrial processes at some point use ovens or kilns or some sort of heat that are an energy that is used to transform the materials. You can think of the different metals that are made from the forges, which obviously uses fire and got bigger and bigger to give birth to the high blast furnaces that are still used nowadays, and which of course use a lot of heat to melt the ore and transform it into steel or different metals. But you can also think of bricks and faïences and different sorts of materials that are also cooked in kilns and ovens just to make them harder and more resistant. And obviously that also uses energy and fuels to achieve. You can also think of plaster, gypsum, which technically can dry in the air. You don't necessarily need to add any extra energy, except that in nowadays industrial production process of plasterboards, they usually use an oven at the end of the process just to accelerate, to make it faster for the boards to dry. So there again, they use fossil fuels to produce even gypsum boards. And then maybe the most representative of all these cooked materials is certainly cement, which is used basically by heating choke and bringing it to very high temperature where it transforms itself into clinker, which is used then to produce cement. Interestingly, the cement industry used to rely on fossil fuels until the 1970s and the first oil shock. And after that, they tried to diversify the type of fuels they could use. And one of the things they use nowadays is ultimate waste coming from different industrial sectors, which are used for the calorific power. So you have, for instance, animals' fats or used oils or different sorts of solvents. Or in some countries, not in Belgium, but in other countries, you can even use tires, rubber tires from cars or trucks that are used as a fuel. And this is an interesting industry, not very well known, the preparation of those substitution fuels. And you see there, which is probably the best modern representation of the entry of hell. It's the entry of like a huge silo in which they mix and they produce this alternative fuel from these waste streams. And they have to do that by paying attention to not overreaching certain thresholds in terms of the density of specific toxic substances such as heavy metals. So they have to make sure that it is diluted in the process. So it's an interesting industry. Cement ovens are also used when you need to make something disappear. So for instance, when the police find, I don't know, drugs, they put it in these ovens just to make it disappear. Or when there is an epidemic of influenza in the meat industry, it happens that animals are just, or dead animals, carcasses are just thrown away in these ovens just to make them disappear. And actually, with their fat, they contribute to bringing this calorific power. The thing is, and you're probably all aware of that, when you burn things, and especially if these things are made somehow of carbon, as all the examples that I showed, what you get is energy on one hand, water on the other, and then CO2, dioxide carbon. And obviously this is a major challenge for today. And somehow these effects are shown on this diagram. When you look at this flow, which is almost half of what results from the processing of the material, it is in fact emissions to air or to water, but mostly to air. So basically, this is a representation of the CO2 that is produced through the combustion of fossil fuels in the processing of material. Then, obviously, you also see on this diagram the sort of linear allure of this diagram. It starts somewhere and it ends in the air in this case, but you also see that there are attempts to close the loops, and this is of course a major theme nowadays, and for us at Rotor, it's something in which we investigated a lot of attention and research. And so to make it very to put it a bit bluntly, during the 20th centuries, the major outcome for used goods was the landfill. And you see this sort of primitive landfills, which still exist nowadays in some regions, which are slightly more sophisticated today, but which also comes with a lot of problems. This is a major scandal in the Netherlands in the 1980s, in which they found out that they built a housing development on a former landfill in which toxic waste was landfilled. And so it produced a lot of a big crisis. And for most of European countries, from this moment on, they started to regulate much more sternly these landfills. And so nowadays you would find some sort of layers to protect the soils and avoid lixiviation and that sort of undesirable phenomena. And then another waste management strategy after landfilling was the incineration. Basically, we come back to this notion of cooking things and burning things. You see there a furnace in Brussels that is used to incinerate the household waste. And then came the notion of recycling. And actually nowadays in the European waste regulation, there is a hierarchy that is enforced. And the less desirable waste management strategy is landfill, then incineration, then recycling. And recycling, in this case, for buildings, for instance, consists of trying to transform the materials back to the raw material that can then be used in new applications. And you see there a crushing facilities transforming concrete and masonry rubble into granulates, recycled granulates. They use different sorts of crushers to do that. Interestingly, most of these machines are originating from the mining industry. And in Europe, in some regions, you can really see a sort of translation from the mining industry that somewhere declined, but usually in this region, you also see a rise of the recycling industry, and there is a sort of a transfer of technology, but also maybe of labor and maybe other aspects as well. So you see there a machine from the 19th century that is still used nowadays to crush these construction rubble. Obviously, these recycled granulates are a good alternative to using raw material. They can help to mitigate the use of virgin resources, but they also come with a loss. There is a loss of the use value of the things. Obviously, what used to be the structural backbone of a building becomes just backfilling material, and it also comes with a loss of economical value. In some countries, in Belgium it is the case, or at least it was the case some years ago, the cost for the most basic granulate was simply €0 per ton, simply because the demand is way lower than the offer. In other words, we demolish more building than we need recycled granulates for building roads, for instance. And interestingly, and that's maybe where the work of Rotor started, it's this finding that if you keep these elements intact, these ceramic tiles, these bricks, or these stone elements, I'm not talking about concrete here, but all these elements that are mixed in these rubbles, if you keep them intact and if you reuse them, they can have a retail value that is much higher than the value of the recycled content. So at least for these sorts of materials, reuse should be the preferred option. And actually, that's also what's written in the law. That's also a small animation that shows the amount of waste produced in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and in France, and in Europe. And in fact, these quantities are increasing. Since 10 years, they have not stopped increasing. So that also questions a little bit this idea that recycling could be the one-size-fits-all solution. It's possible. It's certainly a part of the solution, but it's not the only way to do. And we need to have a more global overview on this question. And that's maybe the idea that we find quite interesting, and that was a bit the starting point of Rotor, is this idea of switching from dealing with flow to managing stocks of assets, stocks of natural assets. This is actually the basis of this notion of circular economy, at least how people like Walter Stahel puts it. And they really see that as a shift in the economy, a shift towards a modes of production of value that derives from maintaining existing goods in circulation, that derives from taking care of existing stocks. And you could see that as a sort of extension of this notion of heritage that would start maybe from this idea of heritage as equivalent to listed buildings, but that would enlarge this vision to basically everything that has been built and that is existing nowadays, and that we learn to take care of, and that we learn to maintain and to preserve. And this is a very interesting and provoking idea. And so you could say that basically it means stopping these flows of material, stopping the production of new goods, stopping the extraction of raw material, and as a consequence, you probably also stop the emissions and the pollutions, and focusing on the use of material and trying to keep this material in use for as long as possible. Obviously, it mostly concerns what I would say inert materials. Food, for instance, couldn't follow the same sort of pathway, but I think for the construction industry, it's a very interesting notion. And so, yeah, what Walter Stahel explains is that basically all the industrial economy is based on this idea of increasing the sale of material and finding an optimum in the production process to put on the market as much goods as possible. And as a consequence, also to make goods that do not last too long, for they can be replaced by the consumers and sustain this sort of productivist economy. And the shift towards what could be a circular or radically circular economy would be to focus on trades such as maintaining buildings and taking care of them and cleaning them. Or you can find other examples in the industry of the scaffolding, for instance, in which systems are designed that can be easily dismantled and demounted and reused again and again. Obviously, the time span of a scaffolding is relatively short, so it's quite easy to imagine these sort of systems. It's a bit harder to translate that into I would say actual buildings that are expected to last for at least a few decades, but nonetheless there are interesting things to learn from these systems. And another example of what could be an already circular economy is all these companies that are active in the reclamation and the salvage of building components that can then be reused. In fact, reuse is an excellent way to keep in use a material that is not useful anymore at some place, but that can still be used somewhere else. And this economy of reclamation dealers for us at Rotor is super inspiring and super important, actually, because it shows that this notion of circular economy is not only wishful thinking. Somehow there are good examples of practices nowadays that are able to create prosperity with activities consisting of maintaining existing materials in circulation, such as, for instance, here, these cast iron radiators that are completely refitted and put back on the market to be reused. And the amount of energy that they embed is of course, incredible, and so keeping them in use is a way to amortize this environmental credit, if I can say it like that. And that is a project that is very important to us at Rotor. It's documenting this already circular industry and more specifically reclamation dealer. And this is a project we started in 2011, and the idea was pretty simple. It was to say, okay, there is a will in the Brussels region to apply this principle of reusing building material, but it would be a mistake to start from scratch. It would be better to look at what already exists and see what we can learn from that, and maybe build something upon that instead of starting from a white page. And so we proposed the public authorities to subsidize us to document the existing trade. And at that time in Brussels, they were known, as you can see, but if you ride 30 kilometers around the city, then you start to find quite a lot of existing companies, some of them in activity for a few generations, and still perpetuating these practices of reclaiming and salvaging building materials. The methodology for this project was pretty simple, although very time consuming as well. We visited all these companies. So it was a sort of a field trip, a lot of travel through the country, but it allows us to meet all these companies. Most of them are pretty small. It's often family business with a few employees. And so it was super enlightening to meet them and learn what kind of materials do they trade in, what kind of allied services can they offer, that sort of things. And so the results of this huge field work was published on a website that is called Opalis. Opalis.eu is the URL, and which basically is a directory of these dealers. So each dealers that we visited has a short description, a few pictures, and you see there successive versions of the website. With the years, we also complemented this database with examples of projects illustrating how materials can be reused. This is an example of reusing bricks for a public space in Bruges. And these last 3 years, we've been carrying out a huge European project. I mean, huge, at least for us, it was huge. We were 8 partners involved in this, with 3 of them especially focusing on documenting the reclamation trade in France. That was with Bellastock. In the Netherlands, that part we took in charge ourselves, but also for the United Kingdom and Ireland, and that was Salvo who did that. And so for the continental part of Western Europe, we used Opalis, and you see there the map with all those dealers. You see the density in Belgium and Netherlands, but you also see that in France, there are quite a lot of them as well. And as far as we know, in each country in which we tested and started to scratch, we found such companies. So that's also interesting to note. And I think Opalis was a very important project for launching rotor deconstruction, because among other arguments, we found out that if certain materials were taken in charge by these existing companies, there were still a few missing links, and more specifically urban materials and materials coming from offices building and specifically urban types of buildings were not usually salvaged, or at least a much lesser rate than rustic or traditional classic materials such as bricks or pavers and stones and that sort of thing. And for us, it was important because we were based in Brussels, we still are, and in Brussels there is a huge presence of offices building that produce quite a lot of waste during their transformation or their demolition and reconstruction. And so for us, it was important to develop also a sort of a salvage business around these more modern materials. So we are based in Brussels. We moved here in 2016. You see there, it's really the city center. You see there downtown. So it's a very interesting place, just in between the residential, very dense, popular area of the city, and then a more industrial part alongside the canal, of which you see a small bit there. So we are, for the moment, in a former chocolate factory. We don't use all this white warehouse, only a part of it, but we use all this yard and this warehouse. So basically, reusing materials requires quite a lot of space, and in an urban context, it's not always easy to find that. So that's for us a very big challenge. But we found out this place on a temporary basis, and so that was a good solution. You see there a few pictures of the type of materials that we reclaim and propose to our customers. So these are pictures of the showroom, which is actually just behind me, where you see also a bit more precious materials such as luminaries and lighting fixtures, that sort of things. This is a picture of the warehouse outside, where we store more bulky materials, but that cannot be left outdoor. Sorry. It has been quite an adventure to launch Rotor DC. Basically, we had to learn a lot of things while doing it. We are still learning quite a lot of things. Even marketing materials is a challenge in itself. So beside the physical showroom, we also launched a web shop, which also allows us to keep a good view on the stocks. Because obviously that's quite important to know when you have a limited amount of, say, reclaimed ceramic tiles. You need to know real time how much of it is still available for the customers, and so that's why we invested in this digital solution. A big part of the work is also the reclamation itself, the unbuilding of the materials. Sometimes we do that ourselves, and we have the teams inside in-house that are able to do that. But we also try, and we increasingly try to collaborate with other contractors of the construction industry, demolition contractors, but also a different type of specialized trades. That can bring materials to our facilities, and we take them in store. We clean them, we put them back on the market, and then we share the profits of the sale with these people who bring the materials. So it's a good way for us to expand the amount of materials, but it's also interesting because in this scheme, each and every contractor can become a salvager in at least potentially. And so that also allows us to focus on the actual preparations of the materials, because there is a big difference between a material that is just raw from the dismantling and a material ready to be reused. Sometimes you need to clean edges, you need to remove traces of mortar, you have to cut things to dimensions, you have to rewire all electric appliances, you have to clean sanitaries, for instance. You have to document the materials because obviously the customers want the most precise information. And then there is all the sale aspect and welcoming the clients and offer them the services that they may need. And what is paradoxical is that this idea of reusing and developing a business around reclaimed materials is not really new. In fact, when you look at the big picture, it used to be the norm during most part of history, and it started to decline only during the 20th century. So when you look back in old specification books, this is an example from the 18th century in which you can read, although it's written in Old French, but basically it requires the contractor to reclaim the stones from a church tower and to store them carefully on site so that they can be reused in the new development. And so obviously this kind of clause could be copy-pasted in contemporary specification books. It wouldn't need a lot of adaptation to be meaningful today. This is another example, the Cathedral of Liège, that has been completely destroyed during the French Revolution, but that was still used as a sort of urban quarry for stones during decades and decades, and archaeologists still find stones from this cathedral being used in different buildings all around. This is a close-up of this painting in which you see a stone cutter, and maybe these people there are, I don't know, counting stones or assessing whether they will find what they need, or we can still dream what they are doing. This is another example from a sort of early directory of contractors in Paris this time. And when you look at the section demolition contractors, you see that all of them were also active in the sale of salvaged materials. And so it was a completely complementary business to be on one side active on the demolition side, but on the other side also having a sort of salvage yard in which people could buy reclaimed materials. This is an example from early 20th century in Brussels. It's impressive to see how well sorted these materials are. And obviously there is the intention of reusing part of them. And so that explains why so much care is invested in this demolition. And if you look there, you see this small ad on the facade, which advertises the sale of facade materials. And so apparently the demolition site at that time used to be also sort of a salvage yard, a shop where people could buy materials. And so that's also an interesting story. Even in the middle of the 20th century, during a world exhibition in Brussels in 1958, a lot of pavilions that were built in steel could be entirely unmounted and rebuilt, sometimes a few kilometers further, sometimes even in another country. And some of them are still used nowadays with different functions and programs. So that's another interesting story. But it's probably more the exception than the norm, because since the second half of the 20th century, it's a completely different story that grew, and it's a story of destroying building, making them explode by using explosives such as dynamite, and then just throwing all the rubble in a landfill or in a brown field nearby. So there is this famous image of the demolition of Prutigu in St. Louis, the USA, which has been presented as the day modern architecture died by Charles Jenks. And obviously this sort of paradigm shift has many reasons and many factors behind it. The mechanization of the works certainly plays a big role there. The apparition of jackhammers and diesel motors, diesel engines, the development of bulldozers during World War II was also a big factor for the mechanization of the demolition works. The cost of the labor was also an important factor, and the need for speed, especially in urban area, was probably also a determining element. So this is a press clipping from the New York Times in the 1931, in which a demolition contractor explains how his trade has changed in a few years time span, saying the high cost of labor made it unprofitable long ago to clean off the old bricks for second use. Thus, the wrecker saves what he can, but only as long as salvaging does not slow him up unduly. So there is really this expression of this need for speed. And even in the contracts for the demolition works, you can see a shift towards a new system in which contractors are asked to be as swift, as quick as possible, and they can get premiums if they are faster than expected, but equally they can get high penalties if they're unable to meet the deadline. And so there is really a sort of increasing of the need for speed. Another important factor was probably also the huge diversification of building materials in the second half of the century, which made it much more complex to organize the salvage and the reclamation of materials afterwards. So where does that lead us today? Because all these factors obviously are still present today. There is still need for speed. There is still a pressure from the real estate. The labor in Europe is still relatively high, and we still face a huge diversity of materials. So a good way to summarize how reuse can be implemented in project is through this notion of flexibility. And to illustrate that, I would like to share with you a relatively recent project, the renovation of the Zineca facilities, a project we co-designed with Zineca themselves, so as a contracting authority, but also with the architects from West, a Brussels-based office. And so Zineca is active, it's a artistic and cultural organization in Brussels. A few years ago, they could acquire a strange building made of these two street houses, quite beautiful classical Brussels houses. This what we called it the castle. It's a huge building with a patio, and then this sort of industrial warehouse with the small house in front of it. And in between, there is a house that is not part of their facilities. And so they launched, thanks to a European funding, they launched a renovation project for these buildings. You see there the section of the castle with the patio. To make a long story short, I will just focus on one specific intervention in this building, in this project, which had as an objective to preserve as much of the existing building as possible. So really consider it as an heritage that should be preserved, and just with very small interventions, adapt it to its new functions and enables new uses in it. But also another objective was to foster the reuse of building materials. And one operation concerned the windows, for which we tried to find reclaimed windows. And so there is a market for reclaimed windows. There are a few dealers that are specialized in this sort of materials, and some of them even have their stock online. So that's pretty convenient when it comes to searching for specific sizes and specific types of windows. So we knew that it would be possible to find this sort of windows. But then we had to introduce the building permit. And at that moment, obviously, the contracting authorities hadn't bought any material yet, because they weren't sure whether they would get this building permit, or maybe they would get it, but with some modifications, requests. So what we did was just to suggest the minimal and the maximal area for these windows. And we did that by summing up all the requirements in terms of urbanism, in terms of fire safety, in terms of lighting, etc., etc. And so it was a almost mathematical formula that gave us these minimal and maximal areas. Because it was a back facade with not a lot of views from the street, it was accepted by the urban administration. But then we had to contract and to procure these windows. And for that, we had to write down some sort of specifications that needed to be specific enough to be sure that we met a series of important performances, for instance, in terms of energetic performances. But all the while, they needed to be quite open on some aspects, just to make sure that we would meet the offer, the actual offer of the market. So for instance, in terms of colors, we had absolutely no requirement. It wasn't important for us as long as they had these and that dimensions and were performing enough. So we also had to contract that in the contract for the workers, for the work contract, sorry, and so explaining to the contractor that they would need to buy these windows from the reclamation market and then install them, and then when the works went quite on, we looked back to what was available at that very moment, and to our surprise, there were more options that met our requirements than we expected. And so that allowed us to start a sort of a composition exercise, and the architects had a lot of fun doing that, because at some point we were afraid that it would be a sort of a slightly disappointing, decision that was based on one element or two elements and sort of a yes or no choice, but it wasn't the case. Actually, there was enough things, enough windows to really, yeah, to really design things as an architect. And interestingly, among the selection, there was a rounded window, and I'm pretty sure that the architects from West would not have drawn that spontaneously. But because they found it interesting in the selection, they started to play with it in their composition, and ultimately they used it for the window. They just turned it upside down to give it a bit more effect, also for the interior design. And so that's the almost finished results. In this case, the fact that the facade was a wooden structure allowed us also to have this sort of flexibility in terms of the dimensions of the base. Another example was the procuring of ceramic tiles. It's exactly the same exercise, trying to define what is important and what is less important to make sure to meet the available offer on the market. And these were used for different parts of the building. So these are only two examples, but in the end, we did a lot of efforts to promote reuse in this project. And at the end, we made a report on these efforts, and this is the summary of that. And you see on the visual representation that the efforts in terms of preserving this heritage were quite intense. So we could preserve 94% in mass of the existing building, meaning that we did not remove a lot of materials from these facilities. And this is the representation there, the waste, the demolition waste that were quite minimal. And then this is the representation of all the materials that were imported on site for the new developments. And 12% of these are from a reuse origin. And so that's a pretty high score. It's explained because it was a pilot project with specific funds to explore and to develop new solutions. So I don't think another project, or I'm pretty sure that without this public funding, we wouldn't have reached such a result. But even as a high results here, it's still pretty low, and it's sometimes a bit yeah, I don't know, depressing almost to see that despite all these efforts, you can only reach 10% of reuse. And I think it's important to mention a few barriers that, in my opinion, are behind the influence of the architects. That's something that are more related to the global context in which we operate. And there is only so much you can do as part of a specific project. And it's important also to have a more holistic view on these obstacles if these are to be tackled and if reuse is to be promoted for its environmental benefits, for instance. So one of these barriers, obviously, is the cost of new materials. Actually, you may say that new cheap materials are the main competitor to reclaimed equivalents. This is a good example of concrete pavers, which technically speaking are super easy to unmount, to dismantle, and to reclaim, but the cost just to put them on a pallet is higher than importing a pallet of new concrete on site. And so in nowadays economy, there is really this glass ceiling of the cost of labor that prevent these materials from being regularly reclaimed and reused. And this is only possible in very specific contexts. So yeah, this is a big obstacle for us. Another big obstacle is the way the construction industry is used to define and to control this idea of quality. And I think we have inherited for about 1 century of practices that have evolved together with the industrialization of the production of materials. And so nowadays, the framework to assess the quality of a material are completely adapted for new mass-produced elements, but they are completely unadapted for reclaimed materials, which are often of much smaller, the batches of reclaimed material are much more specific and much smaller, and that requires new approaches. And I'm not saying that we have to lower the criteria for quality, but I'm saying that we have to find new routes, new pathways to demonstrate that reclaimed material meet the requirements. And this is something we've been also working on during the big European project, the FCRBE project, together with research institutes. So things are moving on that front, but especially for bricks in Belgium, it's an important reclaimed material. So I think we are almost there. It's almost as easy to use reclaimed bricks as new bricks, but for other materials, there is still a lot of work to do and to invest before reaching this level of confidence. Another important aspect is the notion of skills and know-hows, and how the laborers are trained, because when the skills are there, reclamation becomes much easier than when there is no skill, or when you destroyed all the know-hows of the workers. And so you could see it the other way around, and saying that in fact promoting reuse is also a good way to foster the training of the workers, and the things they can learn, and the type of knowledge they need, the embodied knowledge almost they need to be able to reclaim and reuse these materials. So that's another major challenge for us. And then there is another obstacle is this habit. I don't know how it happens in Poland, but in Belgium, and especially in Brussels, we still have this habit of completely destroying an existing building to build it anew. And most of the time, the new buildings have almost the same typology, the same volume, even the same aspect as the original one. And obviously, this way of dealing with the built heritage is not very sustainable. It entails the production of a lot of waste. Reversely, it also entails the use of a lot of new materials. Say, for instance, this building, it's about 20,000 square meters that produces about 20,000 tons of C&D waste, but equally you need 20,000 tons of new materials to build it anew. Now, say that you would preserve it, or at least preserve the general structure, you could reduce quite significantly the outflow, so producing way less waste, which also makes it much easier to manage it in a proper way and to foster reclamation in this flow. And equally, if the flow of new material is also smaller, then you can go for material with less impact and to work with reclaimed material or with bio-based materials, which would be impossible if you had to deal with volumes of 20,000 tons of material that have to be delivered in a few weeks' time. And then I'm a bit over time, but I will finish in this last part with another very important aspect for us. And so far, I spoke a lot about the technical aspect or the physical aspect of the material, but obviously a building material is part raw matter, if I can say, but it's also part cultural aspects. And these aspects are at least as important as the technical ones when it comes to foster reuse and reclamation. And this is, yeah, you could mention the notion of obsolescence as a way in which an element is discarded, not because the element itself has declined, but because the context in which this element is placed has changed, and the ways materials are evaluated have evolved, and that makes this material undesirable, and that explains why it is transformed into waste. So it's a very powerful notion, this notion of obsolescence. Yeah, I won't go too much into these details, but let's just remember that, yeah, it's not the material in itself that declines, but the context. And so it means that rather than working on the materials themselves, we also need to tackle and to work on the context and how we look at things and how we relate to buildings or building materials. And this is something that was super important in an exhibition we curated in 2010 for the Venice Biennale, in which we proposed to work about wear and tear. So how the materials age in a building, and how they can become a repository of all the traces left by the users. And it was an exercise. The exhibition in itself was an exercise of displaying worn out materials in a fancy way, in a way that raises the curiosity or the interest of the visitors, instead of provoking a sort of reaction of disgust as it would be in their original state. So for instance, this red carpet from a social housing unit, which was beautifully worn out, because you could really read how the people there lived. You see there the traces left by the passage, and the traces that are kept intact because there was probably a sofa at that point. And when you take it out, you see the traces of the fireplace there. And then we hanged it on the wall just to make it more readable, and to invite the visitors, sorry, to relate and to change their view on these elements. And this was only one of many other objects that we displayed there. Another project in which we played with this notion of how you look at things is the renovation of this former industrial dock in Ghent. Actually, there was a team of architects in charge of redesigning this space and enabling it as a public space. And their project was to paint everything white. And we said, wait. There are traces that are extremely interesting. If you look closely at things, you can read a lot of things about the previous uses of this space. For instance, there you see the colors, the way the concrete decolored is due to the types of materials that were stored there. And so that was left to the open air, and that was mostly covered with materials, or a bit more naively the graffiti that were left by previous users. But we were also interested in the development of plants and lichens and mosses, all these traces that when you look at them carefully, they really enhance the value of the place. And so you have to enhance them, to emphasize them, and that's what we try to do by keeping intact a series of frames in this space. This is another project, a bit more recent, in Palermo in 2018, in which we were asked to work on that huge development that date back from the beautiful days of the mafia, because obviously nobody was supposed to build anything on that part of the hill, but yet a real estate promoter did. But then they had to stop because the judge, it was the moment of the affair of the Judge Falcone, and so there was really a sort of a strengthening against the mafia, and so the construction works had to stop from one day to the other, but somehow the damage was done, and it was almost impossible to undo it. And so all these skeletons, concrete skeletons, are left there for years and years, since the 1980s or something like that. And so as part of the Manifesta Biennale, we were asked to reflect upon that and maybe intervene on that. This huge scar, which is still very heavy for the inhabitants of Palermo. They see it on every day, so it's really a scar on the landscape. And what we did was to propose a walk from the city center to the top of that hill. And it's quite a hard walk because it's very steep, it's quite hot. There is no easy way. We had to follow paths left by animals. And then to reward the walkers, we just adapted one of these skeletons as a sort of refuge in which they can make a break and enjoy the view on the city. So basically the project was just making it secure, avoiding people to get injuries in this place, and to make it a bit more comfortable and welcoming, and then documenting and tracing the walk up to the top of the hill. And the idea is that from the top of the hill, and especially if you walked up by feet, sweating and suffering, and this experience can change how you look at these skeletons and this project. And so that was basically the main point of that. And the name of that project was From Up There, It's a Whole Other Story. And I think it summarizes what we tried to do in this case. A last project in which we explored this theme was a very recent project for the scenography of the Musée. It's a museum in Ostend for Belgian art. And it was in a very beautiful building from the 1930s, I think. But through the years, the qualities of this building, somehow disappeared behind layers of plasters. Somehow it evolved in a strange direction. And so our contribution was simply to remove unnecessary partition walls, for instance, finding back this beautiful balcony, these mezzanines with a beautiful view on the main rooms, but also opening the windows to bring a bit more light. Sorry, I'm a bit too fast. And so a few elements were removed, but a lot of elements were simply displaced. And so a lot of these light partition walls were carefully dismounted and moved in a way and replaced in a way to propose a completely new museographic experience. And so here again, it was mostly a question with playing with what was already there as a way to change the view and the way we can relate to the existing building and to somehow transform it into a valuable heritage that can be that can enable new uses and new applications. And doing that with we try to keep it as impactless in terms of materials as possible. And I think this notion of documenting, be it materials, be it existing building, and finding the almost unmaterial ways to transform them and to make them valuable again, that's maybe also another very important golden thread in all Rotor's project. And I will conclude on that. Thanks a lot for your attention, and sorry for the overtime.
Thank you very much, Michaël. That was fascinating. I think we got a lot of questions for you.
Great.
So I'll try to regroup them. So first group of questions, including questions from Mr. Jakub Sobczyk and somebody called Jopek, is about the know-how and the skills. How do you find specialists? How do you train them, since architects are not trained for unbuilding, rather we're trained for building? How do you find specialists to handle the materials, to prepare them? Who establishes the methodology?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. Thanks for asking it. But I would say there are two scenarios. Maybe the first one is when we work with specialized contractors, and I think when you are able to build something, it's not too difficult to unbuild it. So for instance, if you take a masons, they can build walls, but they can quite easily unbuild walls. So in this case, the know-hows and the skills are already there because it's constitutive of their trade and their profession. It's another story when it comes to the dismantling we operate ourselves. And I guess there we started a little bit from nowhere, almost nowhere, but it's a lot of trial and errors. And the team of people working at Rotor DC, and especially those working on the deconstruction sites, they come from very different backgrounds. Some of them are trained in political sciences. Some of them are trained in, I don't know, bioengineering. Some of them did not go to university at all or to high school at all. So it's a bunch of different backgrounds, but I think it was mostly a question of finding the right opportunities to learn on the spot and building know-hows progressively. And I would dare to say we are still building them up for the moment.
Yes, another set of question is about the regulations, laws, fire laws. You mentioned when talking about the one of the projects that how you had to find an inventive and flexible way to submit a building permit without knowing the exact dimension of the window. So I think this is an example of how you can deal in an operational way with the unknown of reusing materials. But regarding fire regulations, do you think that, yes, what's the evolution of those in the last 15 years since you're working? Are the laws changing for the better? And how do you foresee a future for reusing materials in terms of compatibility with laws and technical demands?
Yeah, it's another very good question. Not easy to answer because it's quite broad. In my view, there are from the law itself, there is no real evolution, and especially in European texts, the only text in which there is a strong presence of reuse is the Waste Directive. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing to start with, but and its recent update just emphasizes even more the need for reuse, from preventing waste by reusing things, goods, materials. But reuse should also cover all these aspects regarding the marketing of products, and these texts did not really evolve in a direction that integrate reuse. So the law, in my view, did not really evolve in a reuse-friendly way. That being said, I think there are quite a lot of evolutions. For instance, in the standards that can be used, and for the moment there are not yet standards or enforced standards, but some organizations are building up protocols to assess the fitness for reuse, in this case the fitness for use of reclaimed materials, and I think that is very encouraging.
But would that be some kind of when we have all those certificates for assessing certifications for sustainability, do you imagine a kind of organism that gives an approval for and that allows the reuse of some material? Would that be the direction?
It could be one of the direction. Another option which I find quite appealing is because for the moment the CE marking, for instance, all the compliance to European standards, they are affixed to materials. So it's really the materials that is assessed. But you could also imagine a system in which it is not the material, but the people who take them in charge that are certified. And that happens, for instance, for welders, because you cannot check each and every welding. So you have to make sure that the people who do the welding are competent enough. And I think that could be a good way, a good workaround to deal with the diversity of materials, because obviously you could imagine doing tests on very recurring flows of reclaimed materials. But then if the type of bricks you would reclaim change from every building you dismantle, then it's impossible to imagine this sort of systematic tests. It would be just too costly, too complicated. But if the salvage dealer knows his trade, and that's interesting because all those companies we visited, most of them, they have a lot of know-hows and knowledge about the materials. Really, there are libraries of knowledge about material history and constructive techniques and constructive history. They should be listed as part of our unmaterial heritage. But yeah, joke apart, I think, yeah, certifying these trades could be an option rather than the materials themselves, at least for some materials, but then it's a complex question.
Another set of questions and remarks that are coming from Mr. Jopek and from Hubert Tramer relates to the Polish context, that many of the projects you've shown are in Belgium, where buildings are replaced with buildings of the same size. But the Polish context is, Hubert points out that we're mainly in the logic of replacing buildings with bigger ones. Do you see there a place for using materials even in that growth logic and pattern?
Yeah, obviously it's indeed a bit different. Yeah, I think there should be a place for reclaimed materials and for reusing material, whatever the scale of the project. But it's true that if let's take a region is only growing, then obviously the materials you would reuse do not come from that region, except if it's growing on its previous traces. But then maybe somewhere else there are buildings that are dismantled and from which you could reclaim materials that could be reused to sustain this growth. So I guess it should be possible, but I totally admit that the context is in this case quite different than what I showed.
One of the spectators also points out that we do have some experience in reusing materials in Warsaw, although it's a very tragic experience since 80% of the city was destroyed after World War II. And whole parts of the city were built on rubble and with parts of the demolished city. But there's also some concrete casting techniques with the building remains that were used, but they weren't technically very performant. But afterwards, after this Second World War period, after the rebuilding of Warsaw, those experiments were not continued. So nowadays we're more in a logic of everything new. I wanted to also have ask you a question about the organization of your office, because like what's very uncommon, I think, is that, and my intuition is that your own organization is almost already a form of political statement, since when I read your CV, you're part of Rotor, the project office, and you're also a managing partner of Rotor DC. And can you elaborate a bit and explain about how are you organized and why? Because it doesn't seem to be a classical star architect organization that's totally top bottom, but something more horizontal.
Yeah, to some extent, we are indeed attached to a sort of a organic and non-hierarchical way of working. But it's a constantly evolving question, because obviously the growth of the team obliges to change a little bit how we are organized. Also the fact that we now have people that are there for quite a long time, in my case, for instance, more than 10 years, and new people are joining in, and obviously there is a sort of gap in your relationship to the project and what previous project and experience, etc., which wasn't the case when we started. As almost, I mean, Rotor started almost as a hobby, a sort of side project that we did in parallel with our studies or with other projects. So obviously we structured ourselves since then, but yeah, we still try to foster a sort of collaborative way of working, and it's always a sort of trade-off you have to find. And so far I don't think I mean, it's probably impossible to find the exact balance, but you can try to approach it. So a sort of trade-off between fostering sort of diversity and allowing everybody to take part in every decision and every discussion, and then being a bit efficient and having to deliver and organizing things and setting some responsibilities and people in charge of specific aspects. So it's really a constant search for the trade-off between these two extremes. And that as well, and in Rotor as a non-profit organization, but also in Rotor Deconstruction. But it's true that it takes a lot of energy and a lot of time to reflect upon these things, and we are quite attached to these aspects that are important to us.
Yeah, because you're like a non-profit organization, but in my opinion, you're doing some kind of you're working for the public, the common good. Like somehow you establish methodologies, you do research, you teach, you allow the whole heritage of materials to be preserved in a very new way. And how do you finance that? What is your business model relying on? Do you have many subsidies? Like it's what if you could just?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
There again, it's important to make the distinction between Rotor Deconstruction and then Rotor as a non-profit. So for Rotor Deconstruction, 95% of the turnover comes from the sale of materials. Or somehow, and it happens that we got specific public funding, but very limited and for very specific projects, usually research and development. For instance, we just got a new grant for developing a new machine to clean cement tiles. And so that's a specific budget and a specific project. Then for Rotor, as a non-profit organization, it's more half and half. So depends on the years and the projects going on, but half of the turnover comes from consulting projects, design projects, that we can charge the clients for, and then the other half comes from subsidies and public funding. Obviously, the FCRB project from the Interreg program was quite a big project for us. So it's slightly last year we had a bit more public funding than own funds. But usually it's the opposite. It's like 60% of own funds and 40% of public funding. But what is also maybe interesting to mention is that we have no structural public funding. So it's always related to a specific project. And so it's not that there is a public authority behind us or in our boards, or we are quite independent in this regard.
We have also another remark from Hubert Tramer about specificity of in some of the poorer areas of Poland, where many people used to travel abroad, especially to Western Europe, to work as construction workers. And apparently they often came back with plastic windows. And so in those areas, houses are built with reused windows that were removed from Western houses or construction sites. So that would be, Hubert, an interesting study to make about the migration of building materials also from west to east, which is also the case of cars. But maybe that would be the occasion, because I think you're going to have an exhibition also in Poland, in Kielce soon. Is it the case? Can you tell a bit more about it?
Yeah, but I agree. It's a very interesting finding, and it would be worth exploring that more in more thoroughly. And for what regards this exhibition, actually, it's part of this Interreg project. One of the many different deliverables was a mobile exhibition shedding light on the existing reclamation trade. So it's a sort of a exhibition version of Opalis. And this is a traveling exhibition. It has already been showcased in different places in France and in Belgium, and so we are very happy to have it traveling in Poland. And I don't want to raise the expectations too high. It's a beautiful little exhibition, but it's quite compact, and it's mostly about the reclamation trade, with a few samples of materials, a lot of beautiful pictures, a few videos. So it's a good introduction to get to know what this trade is able to do and what it achieves today.
And I have maybe, except if there's gonna be a last question from the public, there's one I wanted to ask. Is something, if you, who's your architectural hero? Like, who are the heroes for people that unbuild and rebuild?
That's a very good question. I guess the answer will differ depending on who you ask in Rotor. From my side, it would be hard to mention an architect. I think I got more influenced by writers or by theoreticians, or
maybe a building, or a...
That's a tricky question. Yeah, I've got a lot of examples of building which managed to successfully integrate reuse operations, but I don't think it would be fair. I don't know. It's not. None of them would really be my hero. I'm not sure I have a hero, actually.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe it's a constellation of different influences, but
yes. Okay. No, I know it's a tricky question, but I think it's interesting to see that it always provokes that it's a difficult one.
Yeah.
I wanted to show your book again, which is like a kind of manual about deconstruction and rebuilding, which is like a history of deconstruction and lots of methodology, and which I find very interesting, very nerdy, which I like a lot, and with also brilliant examples also of contemporary situations. But is the book also, does it exist also in English? Because I have the French version.
No, unfortunately not. And at some point we thought about it, but I'm afraid that it would be impossible to simply translate it. It would need a completely revised version, also because it's already like 3 or 4 years old, and a lot of things has changed during this period. So I don't know if I had to or maybe I should leave someone else taking charge of the translation and not being involved in this, because if I start to get back to this text, it will become something else, and I will disappear for like 6 months or something like that.
So I would like, thank you again for being with us today. I think it was a super interesting meeting. I hope the public also enjoyed it, but if we see the remarks and the big amount of people watching the show, I think it was also interesting for them. And I would like also to invite you for the next meeting of this series of 3 meetings, which will be on the 17th, also at 6 in the afternoon, and the guest will be Kerstin Müller from Baubureau Institute from Basel, which is an office that also deals with reuse, but in a different way. And I think you also made Institut Baubureau made also collaborations with Rotor. So we hope to welcome you on the 17th. Thank you again.
Thanks.
And,
it was great to be there, and thanks a lot for all the very interesting and insightful questions. Very nice.